Hi, my name is Kidia. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Instead of looking at gameplay videos of a raid boss or a dungeon that I've run, I'm going to be making a Holy Paladin new players / beginners guide for the Glimmer of Light build. We are going to be ignoring the standard build because it's just simply not as viable as the Glimmer build right now, and that's not going to change before Shadowlands releases. We're going to be looking at 5 different categories today. We're going to make this video hopefully pretty quick. We're going to be looking at the spells in the spellbook, your talents, essences you should run or some that you should keep in mind. We'll be taking a look at rotation, and then we'll do a tips and tricks section at the end. So let's get to it. So first we're going to be taking a look at the spell book, and the first group of spells we're going to take a look at right now are spells that directly heal your target. So the first spell we're going to take a look at is Holy Shock. Holy Shock has a 9-second cooldown. It does a good amount of healing, and it has an increased chance of critical striking for a heal by 30%. This is going to be where the majority of your healing with the Glimmer of Light build is going to come from using this spell. The second spell we're going to take a look at is Light of Dawn. It's a frontal cone. You can see I hit both target dummies with that. Has a 15-yard range and will heal 5 allies that it hits. This then has a 12-second cooldown. The next heal we'll take a look at is going to be kind of a filler heal. This is one of 2. This is going to be Flash of Light. Flash of Light has a 1.5 second cast and a very high mana cost, about 22%, 23%, something like that, of your base mana. The other filler spell we can use is Holy Light. Holy Light does does more healing with a longer cast time. 2.5 seconds. Neither Flash of Light nor Holy Light have any kind of cooldown, so if you want, you can spam them, but you'll run out of mana very quickly doing this. The next spell we're going to take a look at is Light of the Martyr. Light of the Martyr does about the same healing as Flash of Light. It does damage to you for 50% of the healing done, though. You can kind of see as I spam this, my health decreases. Light of the Martyr should only be used in emergency situations. It's much better to cast a Flash of Light or a Holy Light if you have the spare time. And the reason for that we'll get to later is Light of the Martyr does not do any healing to your beacon target. The next thing we're going to take a look at that does direct healing is Lay on Hands. This is a 10-minute cooldown. It's been in the game since vanilla. Has a pretty sweet animation now. It's going to heal your target for the maximum amount of health that you have. This is an emergency oh crap button heal. And the final thing we're going to take a look at is Infusion of Light and Mastery Lightbringers. Those both work together with these healings that we talked about. Infusion of Light is something that procs based off your Holy Shock, and it was that right there. Infusion of Light has a chance to proc. It will give you 40% extra healing on your next Flash of Light, or reduce the cast time of your Holy Light by 1.5 seconds. A good idea typically is to spend those when you get them. Not always though, and we'll kind of talk about that back in the rotation section of this. You don't want to let them sit there for too long because you could technically get Infusion of Light procs while you already have one and you can't stack them, so it's possibly wasting. And the final thing we're going to talk about is our mastery, which is Lightbringer. It's a pretty boring mastery. Lightbringer increases the amount of healing you do to targets that are closer to you. And that's all there is to it. And we'll take a look at our support spells here in just a second. The next thing we're going to cover is support spells. These are spells that are essential to any healer's kit, but don't do direct healing. And the first one of those is going to be Cleanse. Cleanses your dispel. It does disease, poison, magic effects as well. The only thing it doesn't dispel is curses. Gives you a pretty good range compared to some other healers. The next thing we're going to talk about is Beacon of Light. Now, when I cast Beacon of Light on a target, shows up here, you cast it on one target, it stays there permanently, and any healing you do to anybody else, say if I want to heal myself right now, you'll see that 40% of the healing that I do to myself is transferred onto my beacon target. Good idea here to stack that on the tank. You have a row of talents that modifies beacon, and we'll talk about that in the future. The next thing we'll talk about here is Aura Mastery. Aura Mastery is a raid-wide cooldown on 3 minutes. It is going to boost whichever talent aura you have selected. In this case, I have Devo Aura. Devotion Aura, which when normal does it, it reduces damage taken by 10% divided by the number of people within 10 yards of you. When you use Aura Mastery, that boosts up to 20% across an entire raid. It's a massive cooldown, and then you could also do Aura Mastery with Aura of Mercy or Aura of Sacrifice, we'll talk about. The next thing we're going to talk about is a Rule of Law. Now, Rule of Law, that's Blinding Light. Rule of Law is a 2-charge spell with a 10-second duration and I think a 20-second recharge. What that does, it boosts the range and effectiveness of your mastery. So a good practice is to always use one of these when you're using your cooldowns, or also to use one of these charges when you're about to use a Light of Dawn, because it'll extend the duration of Light of Dawn. Let's see. I'm able to reach them from here when I otherwise wouldn't be able to. Next thing we'll use is Blessing of Protection. Blessing of Protection is a 5-minute cooldown. It makes people immune for a short amount of time, and they're immune to physical damage. Bop can be very useful for removing debuffs from players as well. Any physical damage debuff gets removed from that, as well as a few other like magic damage debuffs. The next spell we're going to take a look at is Blessing of Sacrifice. Blessing of Sacrifice reduces the damage applied to the target they take by 30% for 12 seconds. It's on a 2-minute cooldown. You, however, will take 75% of the damage that they take. So if somebody hits the tank that you have Blessing of Sacrifice on for 300,000 damage even, 100,000 of that would be mitigated, and then 75,000 of that would be taken by you. If you could fall below 20% health, and this is kind of important, Blessing of Sacrifice will stop reducing damage taken for the target it's on during that 12 seconds. So you have to keep yourself above 20 during that duration. And finally, we're going to talk about Blessing of Freedom. This one's has some pretty cool uses that we'll talk about later, but it reduces movement and fairing effects. Pretty nice on like Rathian, or if you have the Grasping Tendrils debuff. But it's average person is not too useful. It's not used all the time. When we come back here in just a second, we're going to look at our DPS abilities. The next group of spells we're going to cover are the ones that do damage. Now, while your primary role as a Holy Paladin is to be the group's healer, or one of the healers in a raid, every healer should be contributing to the damage as much as they can without risking the deaths of their party or raid members. And so knowing how to do that effectively is great. The first spell we're going to look at is Judgment. Judgment has a 10-second cooldown, and it puts a debuff on the target that increases the damage they take from the next Crusader Strike or Holy Shock by 30%. That's just an initial burst of damage. We'll be looking at Crusader Strike next. Crusader Strike is a single target melee strike. You have 2 charges of Crusader Strike. They have a 9-second recharge base on all of these numbers, by the way. 9-second recharge, only one charge will be ever charging at a time, so if I use both of them, they're not both charging at the same time, so keep that in mind. Next we have Consecration. Consecration is a ground AoE. It's going to cast at your location It has a 12-second duration, does moderate damage to everything inside of it. And lastly, also a healing spell, but also a DPS spell, you have Holy Shock. Holy Shock is a single target spell that can be used as healing or damage. Keep in mind that if you use it for damage, it goes on cooldown for your healing as well. This is again your primary damage method. As a Holy Pally, you're kind of a melee healer and you want to be in melee range at most times if the spell kit didn't already tell you that. And we're going to take a look at our random spells here in just a second. And lastly, we're going to take a look at a couple different spells that we couldn't categorize or didn't categorize somewhere else, just to round out our kit. Namely, we're going to start with Hammer of Justice. Hammer of Justice is a single target stun on a 1-minute cooldown. It stuns your target for 6 seconds. Holy Pallies don't have an interrupt natively, so having that can interrupt some spell casts and can reduce the damage your tank is taking, especially in Mythic Plus or Dungeons if you stun a high damage mob. The next up are going to be our 2 cooldowns. Our major cooldowns are going to be Avenging Wrath or Wings. Looks like that. Avenging Wrath is modified by a couple different talents in the tree. It's at base a 2-minute cooldown and it increases the damage and healing you do by a pretty good amount. Followed by Holy Avenger, which is that one. Holy Avenger is on a 1.5-minute long cooldown. This is a talent, but pretty much going to take that, and we're going to cover that here in a minute. Holy Avenger, 1.5-minute long cooldown. It increases your haste by 30%, and it increases the healing you do with Holy Shock by 30%. Following that up, we're going to have Divine Steed. Divine Steed puts you on your little horsey. You run at mount speed for 100% movement speed, so any other mountain speed modifiers don't work. Divine Steed is a 45-second cooldown, and it lasts 3 seconds. Like every other pally in the game, you get access to Divine Shield or Bubble. Bubble is an 8-second immunity. It will remove debuffs from you, will prevent you from taking any kind of damage, and can get you a really safe hearth if you're in PvP. Followed by Divine Protection. Divine Protection is your personal defensive ability. Oh, wrong. There you go. Divine Protection lasts 8 seconds as well, reduces the damage you take for 20 seconds. At a base, it's a 1-minute cooldown. And another talent that we'll take a look at here, but I think is worth mentioning, is going to be Blinding Light. Blinding Light is a localized AoE interrupt. Again, since Holy Pallies don't have an interrupt natively, not as important in most raid encounters, but for Mythic Plus, it's almost invaluable. It is on a 1.5-minute long cooldown, and it'll disorient / interrupt targets for 12 seconds. Any damage breaks the effect. And here, in just a minute, we'll take a look at some talents. And now we're going to take a look at talents. Seeing as this guide I'm making is geared towards beginners or new Holy Pallies, we're not going to cover every single one of them in depth, and some of them I'm going to skip over completely. Up on screen, you should see what I'm currently running right now. Now, this does change a little bit depending on the encounter or what type of content you're doing, and we'll kind of cover the basics. In the level 15 row, you should pretty much always be running Crusader's Might. Crusader's Might will reduce the cooldown on Holy Shock whenever you cast Crusader Strike. So, Holy Shock a target, Crusader Strike, and then Holy Shock will come up faster. During your Wings phase, you'll be using Holy Shock on a target, hitting Crusader Strike, Wings will, Holy Shock will come back up, Holy Shock another target, use Crusader Strike, and so on and so forth during that cooldown. And this is part of the reason we stack haste, is to make this all work for the Glimmer of Light build. For raids, you're going to be using Rule of Law. Rule of Law I covered earlier. It's going to boost the range of your heals as well as increase the effectiveness of your mastery for a short amount of time. You could also take a look at Unbreakable Spirit. I highly recommend using Unbreakable Spirit in Mythic Plus. That's going to reduce the cooldown of some pretty important abilities like Lay on Hands, Bubble, and Divine Protection. Cavalier would be a really great utility to take. Gives you 2 charges of Divine Steed, so you get 2 horses. But unfortunately both the other talents are typically better in every other circumstance. On the level 45 row, we're going to be taking Blinding Light. Blinding Light is almost invaluable in dungeon content or Mythic Plus content, as you're going to want to have some way to control mobs or do mass interrupts. It's not super important for raiding, although there's some encounters like Hive Mind right now that Blinding Light has some usage. Fist of Justice and Repentance can also be taken in dungeon content. I don't think they're quite as valuable, but it's situational. Repentance is like a polymorph. It's usable on humanoids, dragons, stuff like that, undead. And it will hard CC somebody for about a minute. Fist of Justice reduces the cooldown of Hammer of Justice. So there's circumstances where you might want to get more stuns out quickly than have the interrupt. That's where you would take that. Or if there's a dungeon you know you're going to want to be doing hard CC before you do pulls, you'll want to take Repentance. Your level 60 talent row is your Aura talent row. Each one of these is a passive effect you'll have on you at all time. And then your Aura Mastery modifier will change based off which one of these you have selected. You should pretty much, as it currently stands in BFA, always use Devotion Aura. That reduces the damage taken by party members by 10% within 10 yards of you, split up, so if you have multiple people, it goes down like 1% per person. Aura of Sacrifice is like an AoE version of Blessing of Sacrifice, but you stop taking the damage from other people when you go below 75% health, and so it's not really worth it in most circumstances. Aura of Mercy used to be pretty good in Legion. Was never as good as Devotion Aura, but it was pretty good passive raid-wide healing. Right now it only does 3 targets at a time unless you use your Aura Mastery, and it just does not hold up compared to Devotion Aura. But if you're trying to be on the meters, it's going to show up where Devotion Aura won't. It'll be less valuable, but you'll look like you're doing more. On the level 75 roll, with the Glimmer of Light build, you will never not take Holy Avenger. On the standard build, you used to take Judgment of Light. Holy Prism hasn't been used in a while, but Holy Avenger, covered it in the previous section. On the level 90 roll, again, with the Glimmer of Light build, you're never going to take Sanctified Wrath, which just boosts the damage and healing of your Wings duration. Standard build used to use Avenging Crusader, which Wings turned into the Avenging Crusader, and when you did damage to people with Crusader Strike or Judgment, you healed 3 random people. Some people hated it. I thought it was okay. It's kind of cool, but it's not reliable and definitely falls behind the Glimmer of Light build. And in your level 100 talent row, we're going to be taking Divine Purpose 99% of the time. That gives you a 20% chance to proc a Divine Purpose whenever you use Holy Shock or Light of Dawn, instantly resetting its cooldown. So instead of having to wait the 9 seconds, you can Holy Shock, then Holy Shock, or Light of Dawn, then Light of Dawn, and that can chain off of itself. So you can get some pretty crazy chains going if RNGesus is blessing you. And then with your Haste and Crusader's Might, Holy Avenger, you can get huge chains and do massive amounts of healing during your Wings duration. Beacon of Faith used to be used a lot in the standard build. It'll probably come back in the future, so it's worth knowing. Instead of having just a Beacon of Light, you also get a Beacon of Light and a Beacon of Faith. Beacon of Faith is 20% healing, and whenever you take it, Beacon of Light is also 20% healing. So instead of doing 40% just to your beacon target, you do 20% to your 2 beacon targets. In raids, you used to put this on both tanks, or in Mythic Plus, you would put it on yourself and the tank, or move it around as you so choose. Beacon of Virtue might be worth taking a look at if you're struggling with some lower keys, especially in like bursting weeks. On a 15-second cooldown, you can put Beacon of Virtue on 4 random players, typically the ones that need healing the most, plus the one you target on. And it'll do full 40% of healing transferred to those players during that duration. But if you take Beacon of Virtue, you don't get a Beacon of Light. So you don't get something to stack on the tank at all times. In raids, that's very seldom worth it, but in low-level Mythic Plus, especially in bursting weeks when there's going to be massive AoE going out, it can be pretty useful for some players. especially if your group isn't coordinated enough to get their defensives and immunities to stop high bursting stacks or keep them rolling. And that wraps up the talents. We'll be taking a look at essences next. And now we're going to tackle essences for your Heart of Azeroth, that legendary neck. For your major essence, there is no world in which you should not be running Vision of Perfection 99.999% of the time. It's going to give you a reduced cooldowns on wings, make it from 2 minutes to about a minute and a half, scaling with neck level. And it's going to give you random procs of wings, meaning that you're going to periodically, even with it off cooldown, enter states of being into which you are the baddest healer in the world. You gotta run it. For your minor essences for raids, you should be running Conflict and Strife, rank 3, Well of Existence, and Unwavering Ward. Conflict and Strife is just a versatility boost. I know it's one of the more annoying ones to get, so we'll kind of cover alternatives here in a second. Well of Existence is passive healing, and has a sweet little visual. And Unwavering Ward occasionally puts out AoE shields for raids. It is a substantial amount of healing over the course of the whole fight. Some other essences of note, Spirit of Preservation. Spirit of Preservation is something you should be running in dungeons. After stacking up to 5, periodically you get a stack of Spirit of Preservation, and that increases the healing of your next flash of light. So in dungeons you want to run a lot more crit than you want to run haste, and getting these occasional huge crit flash of lights that you can put on the tank or some other members of your party is what you're doing. You're doing a lot more spot healing in dungeons than you are kind of glimmer spreading like you are in raids. Lucid Dreams is a shoddy. It's not perfect. You definitely want to run Conflict and Strife, but if you don't have Conflict and Strife, or can't be arsed to go out and farm the arenas for that, Lucid Dreams is a slightly worse versatility proc, but it also gives you a little bit of mana back, so that part can be nice. And if you're struggling with mana, Ever Rising Tides as a minor is not bad either, but you really shouldn't be struggling with mana if you're playing it correctly. There are some occasions where people are taking extra damage, so you have to throw extra flash of lights in their direction. You might struggle with mana in those cases, but generally shouldn't be using that. And then the 0.00001% of time you're not running Vision of Perfection as your major, you might want to take a look at the Formless Void. This is a new essence in 8.3, and it allows you to copy the essence of somebody else. So if you're really not struggling for healing, or if you're trying to do very interesting things in a Mythic Plus, or maybe trying to carry your friends through 2, if they're running Azerite Laser Beam or Blood of the Enemy or any of these other things, you can take their essence from them and then use it. That should be done only when you get significantly more comfortable with the kit, because procs from Vision of Perfection can bail you out several different times. We'll briefly come back here in just a second to talk about Azerite gear, and then we'll get into rotations and some tips and tricks. I'm going to briefly cover Azerite traits. As this is a beginner's guide, we're not going to go over every single trait in the game, because there's like 80 of them too. But since we are talking about the Glimmer of Light build, you do need 3 Glimmers of Light, one on each Azerite piece. Don't feel bad about passing up to like a 30 item level upgrade in order to maintain a Glimmer of Light if you're first gearing. It is absolutely vital that you have all 3 to work. 2 is the bare minimum, but you better have a really good reason for using 2 instead of 3. There's not a single trait that parses higher than Glimmer in this build. Ideally, you also want 1 trait, and no more than 1 trait, of Light's Decree. Now, Light's Decree is actually a retribution trait, so you need to find a piece with that on there, spec into Ret, select the trait, then spec back to Holy to select the other traits on your gear. Mildly annoying, but the increased duration of Avenging Wrath and Wings works on both when you hardcast it and on your proc. It gives you multiple more time with wings up during an encounter than you would otherwise have. Also of note, these aren't nearly as vital, but they're nice to have. Avenger's Might gives you mastery buff whenever you cast wings or whenever wings procs, which is just good stats. Stats are really good for Holy Paladins. Heart of Darkness, also more stats, increases your secondary stats depending on what level Azerite piece you have, if you have more than 25 corruption. So try and maintain 25. I don't like to go over 50 really, but you know, some people are trying to play it safe under 40, and I get that too. But if you have this trait, make sure you're at least above 25. Breaking Dawn is another trait. This is a quality of life change, really. It does increase your healing a little bit, but it'll extend your range of Light of Dawn from 15 to 40 yards, which is pretty nice in a raid setting. Unfortunately, it can be kind of hard to get that with some of the other trait combinations in this raid. I am going to go over really quickly currently what the best in slot Azerite gear is. So the best in slot helmet is going to be the helmet off ny'alotha. If you're just doing heroic or normal, then the ny'alotha helmet will be the best you can. It's a higher item level, and it has some pretty good traits. Outside of that, all item levels being equal, the helm off Mythic Il'gynoth is a little bit better than the helm off Heroic N'Zoth, but again, the Heroic N'Zoth helm will be better than the Mythic N'Zoth helm will be better than the Mythic Il'gynoth helm, but once you get the Mythic N'Zoth helm, you've kind of beat the game already. The breastplate off of Vexiona is the best right now. So a heroic Vexiona or a mythic Vexiona breastplate is the way to go. If you're not able to do the mythic, there are some that you can get with the Residuum Bender that'll beat the heroic version. And then lastly, the best traits, the best shoulders in the game right now for Holy Paladins are either the Tank Buster or the Lockjaw shoulder pads. Both of those are off your Residuum rolls each week, so I suggest focusing on shoulders first. You have 2 chances to get it. They have the exact same trait situation as you would normally do, depending on either one are exactly the same. So they're both equal. Now that we've covered that, we're going to do a real quick thing on rotation, and then we'll do tips and tricks, and we'll wrap this video up. Thanks for sticking with it, guys. Okay, now we'll go over the rotation for Holy Pally. Now, Holy Pally mostly has a priority list, like most other healers in the game. They don't have a set rotation. We're going to kind of smack this training dummy a bit while we do this to kind of give you a feel for what it's going to be. Because the Holy Pally is a melee healer. You do want to be in melee range. The first thing you want to heal is going to be Holy Shock. So your priority list is going to be Holy Shock on cooldown, as well as Light of Dawn, using any Divine Purpose procs that you get. Your filler spells are going to be Flash of Light, hopefully using it when you have an Infusion of Light proc like that. You also want to make sure you are weaving in damage during this time. So I like to use Consecration pretty much on cooldown, Judgment on cooldown, and when I have the spare time and there's not a lot of raid damage going out, I want to make sure that there's a Glimmer of Light on my primary target or multiple targets in like a Mythic Plus or a 2-cleave fight. That way, every time I heal myself, I'm also doing a little bit of damage to the tank, because that's the way Glimmer works. It leaves a debuff that either does healing or damage depending if they're friendly or not. So I'm just going to kind of keep in working in my Holy Shocks here, using them on cooldown. I got an Infusion proc, so I would use Flash of Light here if nothing else is up. Other thing you want to work in is Rule of Law. Because this is a 2 charge system, I like to keep 1 on cooldown at any given time. It's typically a waste. Try to use it right before you cast Light of Dawn. And when you go into your wings, you want to have 1 up or use 1 at that point in time, because it'll boost your healing and the range for your healing. Now in wings, you want to use both wings and Holy Avenger at the same time. You're going to use a Holy Shock, Crusader Strike, Holy Shock again, Crusader Strike. Using procs in the meantime should fill it up to where you have very little downtime during your wings procs. Any downtime should be used on Light of Dawn. Other stuff you have are just situational. Bubble when you need an immunity or if you really think you're about to die. Divine Protection is a standard defensive. You can use Blessing of Sacrifice on somebody that's taking a lot of damage, or Mastery if your group is taking a lot of damage. You can bop somebody if they have a debuff on them you want to remove, such as a bleed, or if they're taking a lot of physical damage. Never bop your tank because it will drop aggro on them if they're not ready for it. But yeah, the rotation is simple. It just takes a lot of playing around with to get the priority system down. Yeah. And lastly, I'm going to briefly cover a couple tips and tricks that I've picked up along the way that might be helpful for you as you keep going. The first thing that's really interesting is that Blessing of Freedom, I kind of hinted about this earlier, can dispel things that have a damage debuff component on them if they also have a slow. So, like the poison in the second boss room of King's Rest is one example. That debuff will poison and do serious damage to them, but you can also dispel that by using Blessing of Freedom. This can be valuable on the third boss of Shrine 2, for instance. You want to freedom off the slow so that you can dispel the person that comes out of the mind control because they probably have debuffs on them. So whenever you can use a freedom dispel, it gives you like a 1.5 dispels per cooldown as opposed to just the one. And there's a few different things out there. Also, Bubble is a good dispel, and in Mythic Plus, it's very handy to use Bubble just when everyone's taking big group AoE. Don't necessarily save it for whenever you are about to die. Just being able to not heal yourself and focus on other people makes a big difference. Likewise, Divine Protection is such a short cooldown at only a minute, and even less when you're taking the Mythic Plus talents, that you can be free to use that as often as possible. Also, when you're first starting, don't be afraid to use wings on cooldown. A lot of times that's the right call anyways. But as long as you're in combat in a Mythic Plus or in raids, unless your raid leader otherwise says otherwise, feel free to try using wings on cooldown as you get more comfortable because it's going to give you a lot of leeway and really kind of help give you the feel of the class. 4 fights to get, once you start getting better, maximum planning, research the fight ahead, and consult with your officers or your raid team to figure out what you need to do and when they want you to use cooldowns. Stuff like Aura Mastery should be delegated on pretty much every fight, and really as you get into it, you should start needing to delegate wings as well, in a lot of cases. You can treat wings like you would treat Disc Priest Ramp. Pop it a little bit early as you start to get more comfortable, and you can get your glimmers on all 8 targets before the damage goes out. That way the next glimmer actually heals a bunch of people at once. Other thing I want to talk about is briefly your UI. So I'm not going to go too much into it here, but I highly recommend tracking all your important stuff near the middle of the screen. Use the UI that you like the most, and everyone's a little bit different. I hide all my bars here, that way I don't tunnel on them and I keep my eyes in the middle of the screen. My raid frames also go down here when I have them, or my party frames as well. That keeps my eyes focused on the middle of the screen. It's much easier to dodge mechanics or see if that's happening on if you keep stuff to the middle of the screen. That's pretty basic stuff that every class has. I'm not going to go too much into corruptions here, but corruptions with leech or corruptions with raw stats are really good. And for the weapon corruptions, what's that one called? It's Void Ritual is very good as well. It wasn't, but then they buffed it. Now it is. And lastly, there's a bunch of resources. I'll link these in the description too. But the main ones I want to focus on are going to be wingsisup.com. That's run by Ellesmere, who's one of the best Holy Paladins in the game. He is with Midwinter, which is a Mythic Raid guild. They were, I don't know, World 20 or something. And Questionably Epic is an amazing healing resource for every class but Disc Priest at the moment. And I know they're adding support. You can use that to sim your stat weights, sim gear, figure out what's best for you based off you have it currently set up using their Questionably Epic Live, and there's a lot of very detailed down guides there as well. I'll link both those resources in the bottom. I know some people like a video format over the big text documents, which is kind of one of the reasons I made this. And I also wanted to try and simplify this as much as possible, and I hope I did that correctly. Feel free to give me any feedback if you have it. If I missed something important, or if you have any questions about it, let me know, and I'll try and answer the best of my ability or address it. And if you like this video, subscribe, and I might do more of these. And leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you guys very much for watching and sticking to it, and have a great day.